So hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to How to Rock Astrology. My original channel was How to Rock a Campfire. I always duff that. This channel is called How to Rock Astrology. And today we are going to be talking about Saturn through the houses. Continuing our conversation on Astrology, Karma and Transformation by Stephen Arroyo. This series has been talking about the keys to transformation. We've been focusing on Saturn, and right now we are in the heart of this book. Most times when you look up like reviews on this book on Amazon or Goodreads or whatever, some of the best, often it's said that some of the best advice and things that are given in Stephen Arroyo's Astrology Karma and Transformation relates with Saturn. The Saturn return video, if you're interested in that, there's a lot to be said about that. If you're going through your Saturn return, check out and like 2 videos prior to this one, 2 or 3. And not only the Saturn return, but also Saturn transiting through the houses. This is considered in some ways, in a lot of ways, to be the heart of this book, in the same way that Saturn is the heart of transformation. It is our grip on our own capacity to transform through the experiences we've had and the experiences that we take on and put effort into for the sake of our deep values, our fundamental nature. Saturn is uncompromising in exposing our fundamental nature to ourselves when we have been evading it during its transit of any house or of any planet that has allowed for us to escape from our fundamental nature. Saturn comes and knocks on it and says, that's not, it's almost like we're overemphasizing a planet because this is part of whatever our energy field is going through in this incarnation. When Saturn has a transit to the 8th house, and we might have a planet in the 8th house, and Saturn is coming through, and that planet might be very used to just attaching itself to the energy field of others just for its own sake in order to learn how to deal with the energy of other people, sexually, 8th house vibes, as well as financially and through commitment and through the commitment to a group. When Saturn comes through the 8th house, we have to learn in that moment what it is that has stopped us in our interactions with groups. Are we evading from groups for some reason? If you've got any planet or your 8th lord is hurting, if you don't have a well-placed 8th lord, the lord of the sign that rules your 8th house, if that's having a gross time, when Saturn comes through the 8th house, it's going to tighten up the planet that rules its sign. That's something to consider. So when Saturn moves through the 8th house, we're going to learn how that unseemly 8th house, how connecting with others to a group for its own sake, whether we've been afraid to do that, and so we've been ignoring a part of our fundamental nature, which does interrelate with other beings, because all beings interact with each other, because we're all one organism and we share our molecules and food and sustenance and energy with each other in the same way that our own liver trades energy from our kidneys and our lungs, and these are all different parts of the singular organism in the same way that we are different parts of a singular organism. So we have to change energy with people, and if we've been evading that for some illness in our 8th house, Saturn coming through the 8th house is going to force you to do it. Or on the other end, if we have an ill 8th house still, or an ill 8th lord, and there's some part of us, or an ill Mars or Scorpio, scorpionic themes and tones, mostly the 8th lord, whatever planet rules the 8th house, if it's in a bad place, and this has caused us to merge sexually in our resource field with others in bad ways, in compulsive ways. That's the other side of the 8th house. Just using any house as an example. When Saturn comes through the 8th house, you're going to learn to be more discerning about the groups that you submit yourself to, the relationships that you try to develop resources with and through, the value that you hold in relationships and sexual relationships and all these things. If you've just been putting your pearls before swine, so to say, Saturn's transit through the 8th will either tighten up a loose 8th house or loosen up a tight 8th house. This is the kind of thing that happens when Saturn goes through the sign, depending on the sign that is ruling the house. Sorry, when Saturn goes through a house, the nature of how it'll come through depends on the ruler of its sign. And that's something very important to be said. But I digress. So that was my own kind of spiel on all this. Let's continue our conversation about Saturn through the houses from Stephen Arroyo's book. As I said, we've come to the chapter where we're talking about Saturn through the houses. Let's start to get into it. And as usual, folks, this is a live stream, so for anybody watching, make some comments, ask some questions, and I'll speak to it as best I can. Whoa, whoops. That's my phone. Saturn through the houses. The key concepts mentioned above, sections A through G, so in the last video we did a few principles talking about the Saturn's transits to any planet. So we were given principles A through G, which also can be applied in the understanding of Saturn's transits through the various houses of the natal chart, with the following distinction. So check out that other video to get a further themes condensing. Stephen Arroyo gave us a list to condense what Saturn is going to do, condensed to show what Saturn will do when it interacts with any important place in the chart, whether that's a planet or a house cusp or the house itself. But with regard to the houses, there's a distinction, and this is what Stephen Arroyo says. Saturn's transit Saturn's transit, an exact aspect to a natal planet, symbolizes the process of defining a specific dimension of the personality with regard to a planet. And it shows what one feels to be most authentically an essential aspect of one's true self, one's personal self. Whereas Saturn's transit of a natal house represents a period of defining one's approach. Oh, okay, sorry, I see. So Saturn's transit of a natal house, as opposed to a planet, represents a period of defining one's approach to an entire area of life, experience, and activity. Very often, the changes represented by Saturn's transits of the natal houses are more publicly noticeable than Saturn's transits of the natal planets. Meaning that you don't just feel them. Sorry, I got a little bit of a frog in my throat there. It seems that Saturn's transits to planets, certain planets you are bound to feel them, especially if the Saturn transits a planet that acts as an angular lord, meaning that the first, fourth, seventh, or 10th cusp lands in the sign of the planet that Saturn is transiting. Let's say I'm a Leo rising, and my 4th house cusp lies in Scorpio. That means that whenever Saturn transits my Mars, my natal Mars, it's also hitting an angular lord, because the 4th house, which is an angle, is in the sign of Scorpio. So Mars, which rules Scorpio, is carrying my 4th angle. So if Saturn transits Mars, it is affecting an angular lord, which has deep, which you will feel directly in your life. It'll show a real making the rafters of your whole firmament shake, especially with the 4th house lord when Saturn transits there. But if it's You know, if your fourth lord is well placed, if my Mars is well placed, then Saturn coming through will give me the rewards for the good things I've done with Mars, and judgment for the bad things I've done with Mars. And my Mars is well placed well enough, so I don't have a fear of dealing with Saturn transiting Mars as much as I might with some other planets, you know? But I digress. The point is that Saturn transiting over an angular lord is bound to be show directly. But other than that, except with regard to the sun and the moon, you'll generally always feel that when Saturn crosses these places. With what Arroyo's saying is that with planets, it's not always going to be a direct experience that you can correlate directly with Saturn transiting this or that planet. But what he's saying is that with the houses, it's usually more tangible. You'll usually really see the world conspiring to employ Saturn's lessons in a weird psychedelic way. It shows like the power of synchronicity and the plan of the universe being in cohesion with Saturn's nature and its cycles. So, the changes represented by Saturn's transits of the natal houses are more publicly, directly noticeable than Saturn's transits of the natal planets, although there are many exceptions to this general rule. That's why I was saying the angular lords are an exception to that rule. If a person is born with any planet accidentally dignified, meaning natally located in the house with which it is associated, the period when Saturn is transiting that house will be especially important and powerful for the themes related. For Saturn will then conjunct the particular planet during the same period when it is in the house related to that planet. It's very cool. I would say there's less an emphasis of this particular thing in Vedic astrology. I'm a Vedic astrologer, and I always like to make that point. Western astrology really contends that the shape of the house can interact with the shape of the planets, and in a Vedic astrology we'd say it's more about the signs. The houses are really their own thing. So to say that Mars naturally rules Scorpio. So if Mars is in Scorpio in the 8th house, there's a deep emphasis of 8th house themes and scorpionic themes all jammed up in there. And if Saturn transits that place, then it's going to be dealing with all these themes. It would actually be good because Mars doesn't do bad. The 8th house is a tough place, but Saturn going through there would give that Mars a lot of strength, and it's in its own sign, so it would be okay. And that is a good, strong thing, but it's not like a bad thing. A planet in its own sign is always good. The 8th, to me, that 8th house adding more of the scorpionicness, it's true, but I wouldn't say that it's doubled in Saturn's transit is doubled in strength necessarily as heavily as is emphasized here. I digress, sorry. I'm going to be honest and true to Stephen Arroyo's text, and I just like to make my own points once in a while. Well, let's stick to our script here. So in other words, he gives us an example of what he's saying, and there is some truth to it. In other words, if one is born with Venus in the 7th house, then when Saturn conjuncts Venus, it will also be in the 7th house, thus giving us two separate symbols of a similar process of defining and structuring one's awareness of companionship and love needs. Yeah, this is true. He is correct here. This would be what I call a theme in the chart. For that person would then experience this pressure to face relationship feelings and activities more realistically as a major theme in his or her life for many months, and possibly even for over 2 years. But in any case, Saturn's house position invariably shows what field of personal experience one is, or should be, trying to structure and define more clearly, and in what area of life activity one should be trying to build a solid, lasting understanding and approach, no matter what the house is that it's in. And it's through the house that we really arbitrate the effects of Saturn transiting a natal planet. You know, if Mercury is in the 4th house, you know, it's the transit of Saturn through that 4th house and the activity of the 4th house that is the ground upon which Mercury grips the energy field on Earth, and therefore the house is the vessel of Mercury's energy, and so the 4th house is what is going to be rippled by Saturn's presence, and that affects the change to Mercury. It's not necessarily the other way around, unless Mercury rules the 4th house. But I digress. Considering Saturn's cycle through all the 12 houses as a complete circle of life experience and maturation is necessary in order to put into perspective the meaning of Saturn in any particular house. Right. But it is equally important to know why one is emphasizing a certain starting point or focus during this cycle. The natal position of Saturn is naturally one focal point in this entire cycle and in the growth process which it symbolizes. So whichever house Saturn is in shows the starting natal point of Saturn's own 12th house return, and that affects what it means. Say, you know, if Saturn is in the 6th and you're born with Saturn in the 6th, when Saturn comes around to the 1st house, it will have spent a certain amount of years. That'd be like 2.5 times 8, which is about like 20-ish years. It will have been moving for about like something like that, 20-ish years. Anyway, it will have taken that much time to get to your 1st house. Whereas if someone has Saturn when they're born in the 11th house, then when Saturn gets to the 1st house, it means something very different to have Saturn, to have the 1st house in the 3rd house from Saturn, and then to experience Saturn in the 1st house with Saturn being natally in the 11th means something different than someone like me who has Saturn in the 6th house and then has Saturn transiting the 1st house. Something to consider. The natal position of Saturn is naturally one focal point in this entire cycle and in the growth process which it symbolizes. Although Grant Lewis's early work with the Saturn cycle was a great breakthrough in practically applying astrological knowledge and contains a great many valuable insights, Stephen Arroyo says, I do feel that he overemphasized only one approach to the Saturn cycle, namely, its meaning in relation to worldly achievement and career goals. It's sort of an ancient way of defining Saturn. If, like Lui, one is using the transits of Saturn through the houses as an index of only this area of life experience of career and worldly fame and status, then, like him, one should emphasize the 4th house as a focus of new beginnings, which can lead to achievements as Saturn crosses the 10th house area. In that approach, Saturn's transit through the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd houses, called by Lui a period of obscurity, is not emphasized as important except insofar as it is a period of preparation for the ambitions which come into clearer focus at a later time. It's basically saying, if you only are looking for Saturn as an indicator of career, it's going to have something to do with Saturn's being before or after, or its cycle between the 4th and the 10th house axis. If you want to consider Saturn as a marker of career, that's how you would read it. But Saturn is a marker of karma. And Arroyo here is saying that the 10th house and the fourth house, which are intrinsically linked, would be the arbiters of career and status and the exaltation of that theme. So Saturn coming from the first house and developing down to the third house and going into the fourth house says a lot about the development and manifestation of the self, which ultimately will sustain the career, right? There's a polarity there that's implied. But in any case, he's just saying that career and fame are not the only theme relating to Saturn, although Grant Lui kind of almost made the picture seem that way. If one is using astrology as a tool for vocational guidance alone, or perhaps for personnel work for a large company or for a government agency, Lui's approach and concepts should be sufficient and usually fairly accurate. But if one is involved in counseling human beings at a more intimate and subtle level, wherein their more personal feelings and needs are being taken into account, it will be of little value to tell someone that he or she is entering a period of obscurity for the next 7 years, and that all the person can do at this time is to wait patiently for some ill-defined, but of course absolutely wonderful future work or vocation, which will eventually give the individual's life a profound excitement and significance if that's what the person and the counselor are hooked onto hoping for. So, the indications of Saturn as relates to the vocation, as was just talked about. If that's the only thing you're looking for, you'll find it, but there's way more to Saturn's cycles than just that. The kind of astrological counseling which always uses future promises as the primary area about which one can say something positive and hopeful is also the kind of astrology which usually proves to be empty and to be useful mainly for avoiding the counselor's admission of faulty understanding or plain ignorance. To hold out such illusory hopes to a client is indeed not counseling at all. It's merely encouraging the person to focus on fantasy rather than on immediate facts and feelings, a type of astrological practice which bears great resemblance to the methods of the fortune tellers with whom most astrologers claim vociferously that they don't want to be associated. This is not magic. This is not, like bell and whistle trickery of consolation and then moving the mind in different places and keep coming to me, I will get you through these processes, That kind of baiting is something that astrology has been known to do. Astrologers, although they wouldn't be astrologers at that point, they would just be snake oil salesmen, in the same way that any snake oil salesman of any medicine can lead an earnest person astray. In any case, of all the planetary symbols used in astrology, there's none which calls to our attention more strongly the need to face reality in the here and now than Saturn. Hence, I think we can outline here a more constructive way of explaining Saturn's cycle to our clients or friends, or for our own use in trying to understand our experiences. The best way of viewing the Saturn cycle is to focus on the wholeness of the entire circle, the entire unending process of development that is thereby symbolized, not just seeing it in context, or seeing it in context and not just seeing it as an isolated house that means isolated things. You got to see the sixth house as the ultimate development and result on the activity that happened in the fourth house. You got to see the third house as the mercurial unloading of identities and values built in the first and second house, right? The best way, The best way of viewing the Saturn cycle is to focus on the wholeness of the entire cycle, the unending process of development that is symbolized, with particular emphasis on the first house position of transiting Saturn, since the first house represents the most personal and individual area of the birth chart. By viewing the first house as the most important phase of the entire cycle, rather than as simply the beginning of a period of obscurity, one can take into account the importance of Saturn's cycle as an indicator of not only career and vocational changes, but also of personal inner development on the psychological and spiritual levels. It is in this way that we will discuss Saturn's transits of the various natal houses. But before getting into the details of each house, we should provide an alternative way of looking at Saturn's transit of the quadrants of the chart that is broader and more psychologically oriented than the meanings given by Lewy, L-E-W-I, Grant Lewy, whoever that is, the guy who wrote the other Saturn book. Similar explanations have been provided by Mark Robertson in his book, The Transit of Saturn, and are based on concepts initially developed by Dane Rudyard. These ideas can be outlined as follows. Let's see if I can do something like this first here, folks. Right, just so you guys can get like a view of it. In Quadrant 1, houses 1, 2, and 3, Saturn reveals our ability to grow in essential being and in self-awareness. In Quadrant 2, which is houses 4, 5, and 6, Saturn reveals our ability to grow in our capacity for understanding and in our mode of self-expression. In Quadrant 3, it's houses 7, 8, and 9, going past the 7th house, Saturn reveals our ability to grow in our method of functioning with other people and in our awareness of others as individuals. And you guys can see the point. In the final quadrant, that's houses 10, 11, and 12, Saturn reveals our ability to grow in our capacity for and in the expression of our influence on others or on society at large. Wonderful stuff. So once Saturn goes past the first house, it has taken enough time of looking at the world outside of itself, and now it begins to dig in deeply into the world within, the emotional, psychological, self-seeking, self-realization instinct of the world inside the self, until eventually it passes over the 7th house cusp, at which time it becomes enamored by its interrelations with others, with the world outside of itself. Eventually it reaches the 10th house cusp, where our relationships with others are bound to crystallize and ferment the personality which we are between and above and beyond and within all of our relationships in our history and our lineage, as the 10th house of our worldly action pours into the 11th of our gains and fame, and the 12th of our past life spiritual merit and psychic energy deposits, which is the seed of our next life. And also our next cycle, our next period, where Saturn once again starts to express in the first house and then eventually go through the first house and the 4th house again. Now, Stephen Arroyo continues on. It should be noted that the above concepts, that's these guys, what we just went through, Saturn through the quadrants. It should be noted that the above concepts are general in nature and are for the purpose of giving the astrologer an overall sense of the meaning of the Saturn cycle. In most cases, the most accurate approach is to keep this general outline in mind as a background for understanding the specific experiences shown by transiting Saturn's exact house position. Another point worth mentioning is that the meaning of a Saturn transit through a particular house may change noticeably as Saturn proceeds further and further into that house. As Saturn begins to enter a house which is often felt by the individual when Saturn comes within 6 degrees or so of that house's cusp, although the planet may technically still be in the previous house. One often feels a more intense urge to do something about the area of life indicated that will be felt later. So it's at the very then will. So it's at the time there's an intense urge towards that experience. Now I'm going to say this again, but I want to just show you guys that Stephen Arroyo has little notes here. And he's got a footnote over what we just said. Of course, it's going to relate to house cusps. Stephen Arroyo says, I use the Koch, K-O-C-H, birthplace house system in all my work. After having experimented with Placidus, Campanus, and equal house systems, I have found that the Koch cusps give the most accurate timing of important changes shown by a transiting planet changing houses. An approximate orb of within 6 degrees of that cusp is used not only in work with transits, but also in the analysis of natal charts. In other words, in a particular natal chart, if a planet is technically in the 5th house, for example, but within 6 degrees of the 6th house cusp, it will often make more sense to interpret that planet as a 6th house planet rather than as a 5th house planet. In some cases, however, both interpretations seem to make sense. That's my take, ladies and gentlemen. Glad he made that mention at the end. If you've got the moon, I'm a Leo rising, and let's say I had the moon on the 6th house cusp, which was actually pouring into Sagittarius, which is usually the 5th house from Leo. I would read that, if my moon was within 6 degrees of the 6th house cusp, I would read it as being in the 5th house from my ascendant, which is Leo. So the 5th house from Leo is Sagittarius, and therefore, to me in Vedic astrology, Jupiter is the 5th house lord. But there would be an emphasis of 5th house as well as 6th house energy, because the moon is falling with so close to the 6th house cusp that it's also a 6th house planet. Even more so because the cusps are dense containers of that house energy. So my 6th house will be drenched in moon themes. And my moon will be drenched in 6th house as well, generally, as 5th house themes. In fact, I would say the moon would unfold through 5th house reality in this case, but it would take on a 6th house internal relationship with that moon. But the physical reality of my moon would be Sagittarius, the 5th sign from Leo. That's my interpretation of that whole house thing. I've got a video on the houses in Vedic versus Western sense. Feel free to look it up if you are curious, or email me or something, make a comment if you like. Email me at astrology@dustincormier.net, and I'll just give you the skinny on my interpretation of it if you feel that you want me to. I'm here to help. So in any case, Arroyo says, as Saturn begins to enter a house, which is often felt by the individual when Saturn comes within 6 degrees or so of that house's cusp, although the planet may technically still be in the preceding house or preceding sign, one often feels when it comes up to that 6-degree orb of the house cusp, one often feels a more intense urge to do something about the area of life indicated than they might be inclined to feel towards it later. The problematical side of Saturn's position in a given house usually seems to be more apparent during the first year or so when Saturn is in that house. After that, in many cases, it seems that the person has been pressured to learn enough about how to cope more realistically with this area of life to enable them to take the further lessons in their stride. So then they can keep dealing with the lessons may keep coming, but generally after a year past that house cusp, the person is starting to get a grip on what Saturn means in relation to that house, although the lessons will still keep coming. Naturally, how quickly one learns the Saturnian lessons depends on the individual, and this guideline cannot be made into a dogma. It's an important point. But it's often the case that a person will feel the weight of a Saturn transit most heavily when the planet is in the first half or so of a certain house. The frustration and pressure to act or to work in some way is likely to be the strongest at that time. Then, as the person achieves more stability and understanding in that field of experience, the pressure still remains, but is not felt internally to be as oppressive or intense. This guideline is especially true of houses where there are no natal planets situated, for when one does have planets in a certain house, Saturn's exact conjunction of those planets is often the period of peak intensity. Makes sense, because the planet is such a holding vessel for other important, for so many different strands of the energy field. If one has taken the proper approach to dealing with the inner and outer pressures that are felt during the first phase of such a transit period, then the second phase may be seen as a time to assimilate more deeply the important realizations involved. Cool. Assimilate. A time to assimilate more deeply the important realizations involved. As transiting Saturn gets toward the end of a house and is about to enter the next house, in other words, when it gets to within 6 degrees or so of the next house cusp, there's often some sort of event, experience, or realization that is clearly related to the entire period just ending and to the basic meaning of the house that Saturn is leaving. Often something will occur that clearly symbolizes a consolidation of the previous 2 or 3 years' efforts. And the occurrence, in many cases, although it's often quite important, will not coincide with any major transit or progression. Sometimes the lessons that you gain from Saturn being a house just happen of a rhythmic pattern which is not necessarily directly discernible through astrology. It just happens by the unfoldment of the need of that thing. It might be a process that takes months, years, lifetimes. Just whatever Saturn is hitting in this particular moment, whenever it's transiting a house or anything. You know, it might be a long time or it might be a very short time before Saturn shows that it has fully gripped the themes related to that house. So Saturn could show its lessons having come through a house in a haphazard way that just happens of itself. Often something will occur that clearly symbolizes a consolidation of the previous 2 or 3 years' efforts, and it might not coincide with any major transit or progression. In other words, in very many cases, no major astrological factor, other than simply Saturn's leaving a particular house, can be found to symbolize whatever is happening. Whatever does occur is often accompanied by a sense of relief, or by a sense of catharsis or satisfaction, a kind of clearing the decks prior to launching out on the Saturn transit of the following house, the preceding house. Succeeding house. I mention this phenomenon at length because I have repeatedly seen it occur with great regularity, and often an astrologer will frantically look for some specific transit, progression, or direction to account for such an experience. In fact, the same phenomenon happens also with the progressed moon, as it is about to leave a certain house and enter the next. And those are very interesting things. An entire book can be filled with my case histories, Stephen Arroyo's case histories, related to these common occurrences. But we must get on to discuss the specific meanings of transiting Saturn in the various houses. And that is, ladies and gentlemen, where we begin the next phase of our journey. I can see I have 3 viewers hanging out with me. I hope you guys have been enjoying. We're not done yet, folks. We're, like I said, we're probably going to go to about midnight today. Maybe a little bit over. Probably a little, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. We got even more than I thought. So we still got lots to go here, folks. I'm excited to finally embark on the thick, dense heart of this whole reading. This has been our intro to Saturn's transits through the houses, giving my own little word and spiel on it. Now we are going to read Stephen Arroyo's interpretation of Saturn transiting the houses. After I go to the bathroom. I'm going to close off this video for now. And if you've been enjoying, and if you're watching live, check us out on the next video that I'm just going to get ready for us right now. Let's say at about 10:50-ish, we're going to embark on Saturn transiting the first house. And eventually, we're going to get through all of Saturn transiting the house.